All right, well, so we're going to talk about ESG, and that is not my office, but I'm in that building. Sometimes I'll tell people I have an office in that building, but you guys wouldn't know, so. So this is a text message that I received from the CEO of a small tech startup in Utah. And he had to fill out a questionnaire from the venture capital firm that had invested money in his company. And they wanted him to answer 74 questions related to ESG. And they wanted information about the board makeup and how many LGBTQ people and how many women and so on and so forth, the demographics of the workforce, and particularly computer engineers. And did they have sufficient number of the chosen demographics? And if not, did they have a plan for in 6 months replacing at least 50% of the computer engineers with the chosen demographic of engineers? And they wanted to know about the usage of renewable energy in their business, and if they were going to increase that by 1% every month. And what about aircraft, the aircraft that you're using when you travel, and whether they had the technology to reduce the carbon footprint. This is a startup tech company. No startup tech company has the resources to do that. All right, so when I talk to audiences, I tell people that this is an American issue that we're talking about. This is not a Republican versus Democrat. This is an American issue that if we care about economic freedom, that we should be against ESG, because this is all about economic freedom. And economic freedom happens to be the bottom of our freedoms. It is the foundational freedom, because if we have no economic freedom, we do not have the ability to support religious organizations. If we have no ability to support religious organizations, we have no religious freedom. If we have no economic freedom, we have no other freedoms in this country, and that's why this is so critical for people to understand. And this is why I talk so passionately about our economic system that we have in the United States. It's unparalleled in the world. So really, climate change is the primary pretext that is driving this engine of ESG, and ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, as we talked about. This is an issue about coercion and freedom versus freedom. And importantly, I don't address the underlying politics, like climate change or social justice. We talk about it, but I don't really address that, because it's really not necessary to address it. It's just understanding the system of ESG is really critical, because that's what ultimately will change our society. And at the very foundation, ESG is incompatible with our free market system. It looks like it sits on top of our economic system and fits in, but it doesn't. It will ultimately replace it with something else. So really, we're talking about globalism. And you think about globalism, what is the plan for getting globalism to be accepted here in the United States and around the world? I think of it as a three-legged stool. So one of the legs is governments, and that's really covered by the UN. The UN with their 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Another leg is the private sector, and that's kind of headed by the World Economic Forum. And they're really pushing ESG. And the United Nations and the World Economic Forum signed an agreement back in 2019 to work together to push these goals on the world. And then, in order to get individuals to buy in, they really saw the need, they meaning the United Nations, World Economic Forum, the need to have religious organizations buy into this as well. And so we're seeing the infiltration of religious organizations to push this agenda, and it really is through the climate change conversation that is driving this. We talked about crises. Pastor Rick mentioned crises and how important it is to understand the crisis narrative. James Madison said, "Crisis is the rallying cry of the tyrant." Even FDR, he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." We are told about the climate crisis. It's catastrophizing the climate. And that's very important to understand. The most effective crises are global in nature. They're amorphous. They are not well defined. And importantly, debate is shut down around it. 97% of scientists agree, right? BS. If you have 97% of scientists agreeing on something, then it's not science, right? Science is it's evolving constantly. And so some examples of past crises that we've seen: global war on terror, and this is where I give credit to Democrats. When the Patriot Act was being discussed in Congress, it was really the Democrats that were concerned about the long-term implications of liberties and freedoms that could be harmed. And now we're seeing the weaponization of the Patriot Act against citizens. So I give credit to the Democrats on that. COVID-19, digital IDs and vaccine passports, and then of course the climate crisis. So if you think about economic freedom, it's really a critical foundation for innovation. The United States has been the most innovative country in the world. We have solved more problems through innovation than any other country in the world. Why? Because of our economic freedoms. You take away economic freedom, you destroy the ability to come up with the innovations that will solve whatever crisis you have. And so to claim that we have to get rid of our economic freedoms to solve climate change is nuts. And I hope we all recognize that. So in Chinese, there's a phrase called gai tong apgang, chicken and a duck talking. Okay, and the idea is that we're having a conversation, but we're not really communicating. That's really what happens with the conversation around ESG, I think. So ESG is often thought of as a benign investment kind of social credit scoring system. It's like a credit score. Each of us individually has a credit score, but we're just giving a risk score to companies. I'll show you what it looks like. And that's really kind of the benign version of ESG. The less benign part is the one that people don't see. It's the agenda-driven strategy. It requires collective action in order to be effective in pushing an agenda. It requires engagement of companies to change those companies, and then it often uses other people's money when they don't even know that their money is being used this way. A lot of people who are pro-ESG say, well, yeah, people can just choose. Well, the reality is people don't choose, and I'll show that to you in a moment. So this is a couple of different firms that score companies. This is Bank of America, scoring them on ESG factors. And you can see that you have, let's see, is this oh yeah, look at that. Well, I can't see it very well, but oh yeah, there's a green light. You can see the green thing. It doesn't work really well there, but it's okay. Disappears on the screen, but. So Rep Risk and Sustainalytics, these are two different ESG ratings firms, and they're rating Bank of America. And you can see that they're coming up with very different scores for Bank of America, which is important because we're talking about subjective criteria. And when you're talking about subjective criteria, you're going to come up with different answers because all of us think of subjective criteria differently. We give different weights to different criteria. And so this is really a function of a market. A market that functions well, it has different views about the future. And when you have different views about the future, you get buying and selling of the same security on any given day because different people have different views about that security. If you have one idea, one acceptable view of the future, you no longer have a market. And so this is a very important mechanism of the market. We should not try to push ESG to have one outcome or one correct answer. What is the correct score for Bank of America, for example, with ESG? No. There should be many different scores because this is all subjective criteria and we're all going to have different answers. So let's look at the less benign part, the second part. And it's really not necessarily that, the underlying politics is the problem. It's the fact that ESG is pushing politics to begin with. That is the problem. It's not what the politics are. You can change from far right to whatever other, or far left politics to whatever other politics. When you're pushing politics in the capital markets, that is a problem. You are changing the fundamental mechanism of our capital markets and how they work. So to show that this is an agenda-driven strategy, this was the first time that ESG actually showed up in print. It's from June 2004, a UN document called Who Cares Wins. And it says here, Only if all actors contribute to the integration of ESG issues and investment decisions can significant improvements be made in this field. So clearly there is an agenda. When you're trying to bring a whole bunch of people together, all actors contributing to the integration of ESG, that is an agenda. So who are these actors? On the right-hand side, it's very difficult to see here, but these are all financial institutions. These were the sponsoring organizations, the endorsing institutions that the UN brought together back in 2004. And I've highlighted the two US entities, the large entities, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were part of this. And notice that these are financial institutions, primarily large banks around the world. That's important because the financial institutions are at the bottom of our economic system. They are responsible for allocating capital. They help determine the winners and losers in our economic system because of that allocation of capital. Money is power. And that is what they recognized, and they recognized that if they can capture the financial institutions, they can drive an agenda through the financial markets, and that's exactly what we're seeing. As I mentioned, ESG is incompatible with free markets. Why? When you have many actors, that's all of these different entities that are operating in the capital markets. You have investors, you have companies, you have banks and insurance companies, et cetera. When you when you force everybody to have the same viewpoint, you destroy the plurality of the capital market. So if I'm a bank and I decide that you're too risky of a credit, another bank will come in and say, no, I'll take that risk. But when all banks of a certain size have said, well, no, we're not going to underwrite that risk, we've committed not to do that, you no longer have a market. So one of the saddest things in America has been this war on business. We even hear people today say, oh, here's how business is giving back. Here's how we're giving back, as if we've been stealing from people, right? Business is fundamentally good. We are providing the goods and services to people at low costs or reasonable costs. That's the benefit that they bring to society. And yet we have been telling people how awful business is. And that is really sad because our economic system supports our freedoms as individuals and society. This economic system that we have, it is more efficient from a financial perspective, which means we generate more wealth. It means we have better customer satisfaction. The markets match producers and consumers, which is good for all of us. That's why the United States has become the wealthiest country in the world. And we did it very rapidly. I think somebody told me by 1820 we were the largest economy in the world, surpassed Great Britain. It did not take long because we had the best economic system in the world. And we still do, but it's under threat now like never before. So, stakeholder capitalism. How many of you have heard of that term, stakeholder capitalism? Okay, we have traditional capitalism, we have stakeholder capitalism. What's the difference? So, stakeholder capitalism talks about different stakeholders that a company has to serve. And they include the government, customers, suppliers, employees, even shareholders. Now, in the United States, we have what's called shareholder supremacy. Why is that such an important concept? Because guess who's at the bottom of the chain, of who gets paid last in the corporate world? If a company is publicly traded, they have to take care of their customers. They have to pay their taxes. They have to take care of the bondholders. The shareholders get paid last. They are at the bottom. When a company goes out of business, the shareholders end up with nothing. The bondholders take over and the government makes sure they get their pay, right? So what happens in stakeholder capitalism is now we've taken the shareholder and said, we're no longer going to just focus on your needs, even though you get paid last and you're taking the risk with your money as an owner of that business. We are now going to elevate all of the other stakeholders and thereby reduce the importance of focusing on your needs. And ultimately what happens is companies then have to serve society. And when companies serve society, they serve political agendas. And that's what we're seeing with stakeholder capitalism. It is a very subtle way of shifting the focus in our economic system away from the economics and protecting those who are taking the economic risk and pushing businesses into the political realm. All right, so InBev, Bud Light, Target, they're doing things that make absolutely no sense, right? Why are you harming your business? Well, if you understand what's going on, it makes a little bit more sense. So there's something called the Human Rights Campaign. The Human Rights Campaign creates a Corporate Equality Index. The Corporate Equality Index has been around for over 20 years. They've gone around to the largest businesses in the United States, and they have convinced them that getting a perfect score will be good for their business. Every year, the Corporate Equality Index requirements for the perfect score change. So it changes every year. The goalposts always change. And this year, in order to get a perfect score in 2023, you have to offer healthcare benefits which cover gender reassignment surgeries for employees and dependents. You have to have mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees. You have to conduct a Bud Light-style marketing campaign. So that means focusing on LGBTQ, either marketing directly to that community or featuring an LGBTQ person in your marketing campaign. Hello, Bud Light. And then have a product line or a service crafted for LGBTQ plus customers. So that's what Target did. Donate to LGBTQ plus charity. You have to lobby for legislation advancing that agenda. And you also need to force contractors and suppliers of your company to adopt many of the same policies. So now we're seeing, instead of the company focusing on customers, they're focusing on getting a perfect score with the Human Rights Campaign. And you see what happens in the marketplace. We have never seen this kind of reaction in the marketplace, and this is one of the most important things that happened this year, is people like you and I said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let companies like Bud Light or Target do that to society. We are not interested in patronizing your business, and that has got to continue, because that sends the message that we care about our economic freedoms, we care about our economic system, and we want companies to serve us, not some organization that doesn't share our values. So let's talk about definitions. This is really critical for people to understand, and I've had conversations with people who I thought would understand this that didn't. People on Wall Street, for example, managing billions of dollars. So we think of, you hear of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. There is a classical social justice and critical social justice, and we've changed from classical social justice to critical social justice without telling anybody about that change. Diversity used to mean ideological diversity and experiential diversity, and including demographic diversity, but ideology was also part of it. That is no longer acceptable. In fact, we're looking for ideological purity and demographic diversity only. When it comes to equity, equal outcomes, not equal opportunity. Inclusion, we used to think of colorblind society and meritocracy. Now inclusion means discriminating against those who do not fit the chosen demographics. This is very different, completely different from what we think of as diversity, equity, inclusion. Governance. This is one of the more subtle changes. Governance was brought into ESG because it actually had credibility. It led to better outcomes for investors. So traditional governance was things like board independence and tying CEO pay to stock performance. But in the ESG world, we're now talking about demographic quotas on the board or with the employees, like that initial text message that I shared, and then compensation of management being tied to ESG metrics. So with the demographic quotas, the LA Court of Appeals overturned California's law requiring 2 women on boards of directors. That was just earlier this year. These things are completely illegal in the United States. We have laws against them, and yet we're seeing this happen. It's crazy, and we have to stand up to it. So what is the real agenda behind ESG? And remember, the environment, the E part, is really driving the train here. It's all about climate change. This is the most important part of the ESG train. It's climate change, but what is the agenda behind the environment and pushing climate? Well, AOC's chief of staff back in 2019 said the Green New Deal wasn't really about climate. It was about how do you change the economic system. In 2015, the head of the UN's climate initiative, Figueres was her name. She was the one that wrote the Paris Climate Accord. In early 2015, she said, this is the first time in the history of the world that we have intentionally tried to change the economic system that has been in place for the last 150 years. Hello? We're trying to change the economic system of capitalism, economic freedom. That's what climate change is about. And in fact, this is my favorite headline maybe of all time. We cannot fight climate change with capitalism. That was a report that the UN was so graciously paid for. The world's economies are totally unprepared for rapid climate change, rising social inequality, and the end of cheap energy. You know, it's amazing. What are they moving to? We're going to get rid of this economic system. What are we moving to, folks? We don't know. We're not going to say that because that'd kind of freak people out, right? So we'll just say we need to have change. We're not going to tell you what we're changing to. BlackRock. BlackRock, how many of you know, have you heard of BlackRock? BlackRock, the largest investment manager in the world, $10 trillion in assets under management. Larry Fink, he used to create, I don't think he created a letter this year, but he would write a letter to the America's CEOs, a fundamental reshaping of finance. Sounds like we're trying to change the economic system, doesn't it? In that letter, it said every government, company, and shareholder must confront climate change. Climate change is a pretext for changing the economic system of the world and particularly of the United States. This is from BlackRock's sustainability report, the tie-in to UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is basically their ESG efforts tied to the different 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So what happens when some of these goals collide? So we have zero hunger in the world versus climate change. What happens when those two compete with each other? So we have a real live example happening in the world today. The Netherlands. Does anybody know how large of an exporter the Netherlands is on agriculture? Yes. They're number 2. The Netherlands is the second largest exporter of agricultural products in the world, the tiny country of the Netherlands. They're amazing farmers. And yet their government is trying to shut down 3,000 farms because of climate change. Hello, what's that going to do to world hunger? It's not going to be good. It's not going to be good. So climate change clearly wins when it comes to hunger versus climate change. Climate change is at the top, folks. All right, so we think about these goals. ESG has all these wonderful goals. We're going to stop climate change. We've got to address social injustices. The UN, the same thing with sustainable development goals. I call it outcomes-based governance. Friedrich Hayek, he said the possibility of men living together in peace without having to agree on common concrete aims, think about goals of these sustainable development goals or ESG, and bound only by abstract rules of conduct was perhaps the greatest invention or discovery mankind ever made, a system of common concrete aims towards which all efforts are directed by authority would deprive us of the advantages of a free civilization. When we move to things like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals or ESG, we are opening ourselves up to authoritarianism because that's the only way that you can move in that direction, is to micromanage people's lives. So some of the earliest rules of conduct, the 10 Commandments. The U.S. Constitution, these are rules of conduct, not telling us how we're going to live our lives, but giving us ways that we need to live together. All right, so let's take a look at what's happening in the financial institutions, in particular, the banks and the asset managers. So there's something called net zero organizations. These net zero organizations really are organized by an NGO, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and they cover different sectors of the financial institutions space. So you have net zero asset owners, net zero asset managers, net zero banking, insurance, etc. The banks, there's 102 banks in the world representing $67 trillion in banking assets that have signed on to net zero pledges. In the United States, it's about 50% of the banking assets, and the top six banks in the United States have signed on as net zero to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And basically what they do when they sign on is they say, okay, you need to supply 3 sectors, give us a plan for how you're going to reduce the carbon emissions in your portfolio and your activities as a bank. And then over the next 36 months, you need to give the other sectors a plan, put forward a plan for the other sectors in which you operate. And so this is what it looks like. So these are the different sectors that they need to come up with a plan for. So transport on the right, power generation, oil and gas, iron and steel, all the way over to agriculture. And I've highlighted agriculture because we're going to talk about it. But you'll notice the orange line is the baseline, so that's kind of 2019 emissions. And then the blue is the target. Okay, what's going on with agriculture? Yeah, this is pretty serious. What's that? That's right. All right, so Bank of America, this was their plan, their first 3 industries or sectors that they came up with. So automobile manufacturing, 44% reduction by 2030. Energy and power generation there. Goldman Sachs here, the oil and gas, power, auto manufacturing. JP Morgan Chase, they're 3. And I've highlighted this quote from Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan's CEO. There must be collective ambition and cooperation by business and government to tackle climate change. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Like a certain political ideology from the 1930s, Benito Mussolini. Fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. Hello? Welcome to the 1930s, folks. JP Morgan Chase then, about 11 months ago, last December, came out with 3 more sectors that they're going to focus on. Aviation was one of them. So let's look at aviation or transport. 80% of emissions reductions in transport will come from reducing passenger aviation demand. So we need to stop flying or pay green premiums if we are going to get on an airline. Need to adopt sustainable aviation fuels, which are 2 to 5 times more expensive than traditional fuels. There's also a concept called smart cities, so we're going to keep people confined into small areas so that they don't travel as much. But one of the keys is replacing all flights that are less than an hour. And we're going to replace those with high-speed rail. How long have we been working on high-speed rail in California? Right? This is one of the craziest economic boondoggles of all time. How inexpensive is it to fly on an airplane from Los Angeles to San Francisco? It is so efficient. And yet we're talking about completely destroying that in the name of climate change. Agriculture. Agriculture is responsible for 25 to 35% of global emissions. And so we've got to address that. And we're going to address that through land use change, which is like taking forests and converting it to farms, and then the agricultural production itself. So the problem with agricultural production is that we have fertilizer that emits nitric oxide, and we have livestock and rice that emit methane. Rice emits methane. I don't know if you knew that, but this is a problem. So the solution is we've got to reduce land-based emissions by 85% by 2050, which means that we're going to have to cut red meat consumption by 50%, at least. We got to electrify our farm machinery and replace fertilizer. Right now, and I just learned this earlier this week, right now, there are shareholder activists that are pressuring grocery store chains to adopt net zero in their supply chains. What does that mean? It means that small agricultural operations are going to be impacted if grocery store chains adopt net zero. We're going to see a serious reduction in food in this country. California is a critical state for agriculture. I don't need to tell you that, but we are very dependent on the rest of the country and, in fact, the world on California agriculture. This is really serious stuff. So Sri Lanka is a perfect case study in what happens when you go down this path, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. This is something that I just learned about a week and a half ago, and hopefully we'll be having an op-ed coming out in the national newspaper soon. Natural asset companies. Natural asset companies are entities that will be listed publicly on the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange on September 27th went to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and said, we need you to issue a rule so that we can create companies whose purpose is not to make money, but it is to protect environmental resources. So these natural asset corporations will raise money on the stock exchange. They'll take that money and they'll buy land and take it out of production, meaning no agriculture, no mineral extraction, no oil extraction, things of that nature. What is that going to do to the United States? That is nuts, but it is serious, and this is happening today, and nobody in Congress actually knew this was going on. I know because I was back there in D.C. about 2.5 weeks ago. Nobody had any clue that the SEC came out with a 21-day comment period, which ended last week. And World Wildlife Fund commented and said, yeah, this is a great idea. And only a handful of other folks commented on it, maybe about 20. And so my op-ed is making the argument that we have to have a much larger and longer period to comment on such a drastic measure as natural asset companies, because they will take productive land in the United States and lock it away so that human impact is eliminated on that land. That has very serious ramifications for all of us. So we're going to be moving from roast beef to roast crickets. Well, it says whole roasted crickets there, Mike. I'm going to get you some for Christmas.
No, thank you.
Who is paying the celebrities? Nicole Kidman chomping on crickets? She's not going to do that unless she's getting paid, I can tell you that. So, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had the highest ESG rating in the world, 98 out of 100. And they had per capita income about double India, even though they're right off the coast of India. They were self-sufficient. And the World Economic Forum said how we are going to make Sri Lanka the richest country, or make them rich at least by 2025. We have these great plans, and let's see what happens. And then 2022, April of 2022, why Sri Lanka is facing one of its worst economic crises. That was 4 years later, the World Economic Forum. And that's off the website. You can't find that anymore. But complete collapse. Here's how ESG destroyed one nation's economy. So Sri Lanka was self-sufficient in food production until 2021. The president issued an edict saying, you can no longer use traditional fertilizer. You have to go to organic fertilizer, all the farmers in Sri Lanka. And so overnight, fertilizers had to be organic. Rice production fell by 40 to 50% nationwide, and food prices went up 80%. That's a great way to destroy your country. And the president of Sri Lanka was run out of town as a result. In the Netherlands, I mentioned they're trying to shut down 3,000 farms. Anyway, it's crazy what's going on there. There's huge protests in the Netherlands. The government has indicated a 40% reduction in nitrogen greenhouse gas emissions is needed within the agricultural sector. So some farmers are having to reduce their herd by 95% if they're in the wrong place in the country. And of course, dairy farms are a huge part of that economy. In Ireland, they have to cull their sheep and cattle herds by 1 million head to meet their targets. So anyway, that's the agricultural part. Debanking is another very serious part of ESG. Debanking is this idea that if you have the wrong ideas, the wrong political views, the wrong religious views, then you could lose access to your banking privileges. And so this is an article from Barron's. This was in January 2021. This trend of debanking has the potential to turn the American market system on its head. So stopping this troubling trend of politically debanking people, it's been hitting Christians particularly badly. So Bank of America froze the ministry account of Lance Wallnau, who was in Tennessee. And then Sam Bramback had his organization's bank account canceled, basically, at JP Morgan. And it's the National Center for Religious Freedom, something like that, National Coalition of Religious Freedom that Sam Bramback has started. And that bank account was canceled by JP Morgan. Why? They didn't provide a reason, and they usually don't. But it is typically religious-based or political-based. As we see in the UK, Nigel Farage, who led the Brexit movement in the UK, his bank account was taken away. Another example of coercion in banking, this was somebody in another state who's focused on oil and gas, bringing a company to going public with a particular company. His bank, Credit Suisse, said, "We would love to do this deal for you, but in order for us to do this deal, our sustainability committee said you need to tweet out some things," because some of the tweets that he had put out on Twitter were pro oil and gas and questioned climate change, and so that was a problem. So in order to repent of this evil sin that he had done, he had to text 4 things, and here they are. You need to agree that the company activity should be aligned with the Paris Agreement. You need to say that you believe that companies should have a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. You need to agree that climate change is occurring and that carbon is contributing to climate change and global warming. And you need to say that you believe that man is contributing to the addition of carbon in the atmosphere. If you make those statements, we'll keep banking with you and we'll take the company public. He found a new bank. But importantly, he got them to put it in writing, and now it's all over the country. Yeah. All right, so the Asset Managers Initiative. Vanguard was part of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. This is very important. So we see BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. These are the major investment managers. Why are they the big ones? Because they are the passive investment managers. They are managing the money most people have in things like the S&P 500 or any other index. They're very inexpensive because they're not paying for research and all of this higher overhead. They're just buying an index. And so there's been tremendous amount of money consolidated at those investment managers because of their passive strategies. But importantly, they are not passive owners. And so what happens is, this is from the UN PRI, when they make a commitment as an investment manager, when they sign on to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, they commit to work in partnership with asset owner clients. So who are the asset owners? It's the pension funds, it's the sovereign wealth funds, it's the major asset owners that are hiring the investment managers. So they are to work together on decarbonization goals consistent with the ambition to reach net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner across all assets under management. So it's not just ESG funds or it's not just some sustainability fund. It's all assets that they have under management, and I'll show you that here. So this is the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. Investment managers sign on to this organization as well. They work very closely with the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. They have a lot of the same goals. And you'll see principle number two, we will be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies and practices. You may have a passive investment manager, but because they are signed on to PRI, they are active owners and they're actively engaging with companies, and that's where we see major problems. This is an example of the engagement that's happening. So this is from BlackRock's report, their stewardship report. They had over 2,000 engagements with companies globally in 2021, 2022, related to climate issues. So they'll go into ExxonMobil. This is outside of the annual meeting that happens with companies. Companies will have an annual meeting. They'll send a proxy ballot. If you own shares in that company, they'll send you a ballot and you can vote your shares on those issues. This engagement is happening outside of that process, where the investment manager is going into the company, and if it's BlackRock, they're likely the largest investor that company has. So they might own about 5 or 6% of the company typically. And like in the case of ExxonMobil, back in 2021, they said you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. You need to put together a plan to be net zero by 2050. Okay, hello, this is an oil company. We're going to be net zero by 2050. Does that mean we're out of business? Yeah. Cut oil production by 20% over the next 2 years. Who does that impact? Everyone. It's not just BlackRock's shareholders, it's everybody in the marketplace. And so you can see that this is impacting the entire system. Everybody is participating in it, whether they like it or not. Now, the enforcement mechanism is very important. BlackRock says, we did not support the election of 176 directors, so that's people on the board, for climate-related concerns. In other words, they weren't committed sufficiently to the climate agenda, and so the boards of directors are under attack in corporate America if they don't support the agenda. This is a huge, huge problem, and this is done primarily with passive investment money that is just in an index, but they've committed to be active owners. And so how does this happen? Why are they using other people's money? This is BlackRock's head of sustainability integration, or ESG integration. Even though 4.4% of the assets are sustainable in sustainable portfolios or ESG portfolios, she said, if we think ESG risk and climate risk are investment risk, then we can use all of the assets that we oversee to push this agenda. And so it's in the definition of how they look at investment risk, and they say this is all investment risk, therefore we can push this agenda. That's why they don't label it as ESG or sustainable funds. So I said that's a huge problem, and I wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed back in May earlier this year with the treasurer of Oklahoma saying, I believe this is the largest breach of fiduciary duty in the history of our country. So let's take a test. What kind of system do we have here? If we have a system that allows people to have their opinion only if it is the right opinion, if it is based on, this system is based on repeating one narrative regardless of other information that might refute it, a system that silences alternative viewpoints, a system that punishes those who do not go along with the narrative until they agree with the acceptable truth, and the system that punishes people for their religious beliefs. What kind of system do we have? Well, Edward R. Murrow said, the right of dissent, or if you prefer, the right to be wrong, is surely fundamental to the existence of a democratic society. That's the right that went first in every nation that stumbled down the trail toward totalitarianism. And here's the birth of totalitarianism: misinformation and disinformation. All right, so Reuters, November 2020. Misinformation could prompt people to turn against COVID-19 vaccines. That was a study. And then in January of this year, Reuters said, US FDA, CDC see early signal of possible Pfizer bivalent COVID shot linked to stroke. Well, maybe the people that didn't want to get a vaccine had a problem with the potential harm. Twitter suppressed true information from doctors and public health experts that was at odds with the U.S. government policy. And then we had the Biden administration coming up with the Disinformation Governance Board. There was a certain founding father who created a university, the University of Virginia, who said, here at the University of Virginia, we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left free to combat it. We don't need misinformation and disinformation czars to tell us what is true and what isn't. That is one of the greatest advantages that we have in the United States of America is free thought and free speech. ESG looks compatible. It looks compatible with our free market system, but it is not. It masquerades as investment ratings. It seems to work within our free markets. Proponents often say it's just more information. But ESG actually seeks to replace our free market system, and they cannot coexist. It looks like capitalism and tastes like tyranny. And the markets will not easily solve this problem. Why? Here are the bank-chartered FDIC, new chartered bank applications that were approved by the FDIC. From 1990 to 2008, there were over 2,000 bank charter applications approved. Since 2009, there have been about 60, a little over 60. A lot of this is Dodd-Frank, the implications of Dodd-Frank. If we don't have new financial institutions, we're not going to be able to address the issues of ESG. In addition, this is investments in oil and gas funds by private investors, so major institutional investors. I shouldn't say private, I should say major institutional investors that invest in general partnership, limited partnership, oil and gas funds. These are big project funds that help to extract oil and gas and are a big part of our economic system. So back in 2015, there was $50 billion raised among North American institutional investors. In 2021, there was $3 billion raised. The only reason that happens is because of ESG, because institutional investors have said we're not going to invest in oil and gas. We have a chronic underinvestment in oil and gas in the United States. And what happens? We have gas prices that are $6 as a result. There's an organization in California, the 200, is a statewide coalition of founders of civil rights organizations, community and business leaders, housing advocates, former state legislators, and cabinet members. This is not necessarily a conservative group of folks, but they are suing the California Air Resource Board because of climate policies in this state. Why? Because it leads to higher prices and harms the people who can least afford it. The low-income households spend 3 times more of their income on energy costs. And in 2020, minority groups represented about half of those who are living in energy insecurity. It's a huge, huge problem. So really the major theme is centralization versus decentralization across the globe. There are efforts to centralize power and consolidate more power in the hands of fewer people. We see that through ESG and stakeholder capitalism, which is really top-down. Our economic system is bottom-up. Each of us, you and I, as individual consumers, have the right to choose how we are going to spend our money. It's analogous to the Constitution, where each of us, as individual beings, elect who represents us, the individuals. And so we also see things like the CBDC, central bank digital currency, on the horizon. Smart cities, 15-minute cities, talked a little bit about that, and natural asset companies. This is some of the education that I've done with articles. And we saw Vanguard last December drop out of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. Larry Fink says he's ashamed of ESG. He just called it conscientious capitalism. If you understand that the agenda is to destroy the economic system, they can rename ESG or they'll do something else. They're not giving up that agenda to try and destroy our economic freedoms. And so I would just caution you that if ESG goes away, it doesn't mean the agenda is being dropped. And then this quote again, really this represents the death of meritocracy in the United States and the birth of social chaos. So I'll skip that. Anyway, things that people can do. Number one is protect the food supply and our energy and power production. Let businesses hear from you. So like what happened with Target and Bud Light, I do not drink beer. I was at a convenience store, filling my car up with gas, and some guy came out with Bud Light, and I was like, don't buy that. What are you doing? I'm like, wait a second, wait. It was really weird. Anyway, we need to have businesses need to hear from us. We are the ones they are supposed to be catering to. And if they're not catering to us and they're serving some globalist agenda, don't do business with them and tell them why you're not doing business with them. That is very important. On the other side, as people are not politicizing their business, tell them that you appreciate that and you appreciate that they're focusing on their business. That's what they should be doing. Invest in, if you have investment money, talk to your financial advisor or plan representative. Have I invested in any funds that voted my shares in favor of racial equity audits, emission reduction plans, executive compensation tied to environmental or social goals? So that I'm going to end there. I'll leave this one up. This is the second part of what you can do, part of that. But thank you all very much. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much, Marlo. What a great presentation. Wasn't that great? It was wonderful. Yeah. And how do the middle of the road Republicans that want to come across let's just have a group hug and not make waves with this kind of really provocative but true agenda that is right out there? I just read the article about Larry Fink saying he's ashamed of ESG, and somebody was like, oh, great. No, he wasn't saying he's backing off from ESG. Once the left has this maneuver, they just relabel and morph. They relabel and morph. This is on critical race theory. In Idaho, they talked with 3 different administrators who all said, as soon as they passed a law for no critical race, we just called it behavioral health. When they got onto that, then we just changed it to social emotional learning. As soon as you get onto it, they just morph. They don't change the ideology.
That's right.
And that's what he said, oh, it's really about climate change. But I've been following the climate change. I did not know the underlying is to change the entire capitalist structure to a socialist totalitarian system globally. And that's Davos working with the United Nations. And they have to recruit the religious.
Yes, and that's what's so scary, right?
Yes. So, and that's what we see with probably half of the churches in America through COVID revealed themselves to be woke. They're going to get on this bandwagon. They've got the black tile, Black Lives Matter, supporting socialism, and they're going to be all about climate change, because we who try to dig into the science and pursue truth, as Thomas Jefferson said, right? We're going to pursue wherever that truth leads. I'm okay with truth if it takes me to the right destination.
And that's been one of the American values that has kept us great, is that focus on truth and sort of this blindfold on all other things. We're not trying to politicize our system, right? We care about getting the right answer.
That's right. But in that process of, we think of free markets, but really it's foundational with free exchange of ideas that can get to the bottom of truth. You don't need to, and the pushback on the disinformation czar sounded just like 1984, right? The truth, the Ministry of Truth, where they had a hole that they would just throw in and change the whole history of things. So this is what happened in Sri Lanka with the farmers and fertilizer, and what's happening in the Netherlands. That's what's coming to America, even if they can't at the corporate level, because the unconstitutionality, the government realizes they can't do it, but now they're having the corporate elites
That's right.
push forward their agenda.
If you can put it into the private sector, then it doesn't matter who is in charge in Washington, D.C., the agenda can move forward. And that's why it's so problematic, why ESG is a problem, and why these natural asset companies are such a problem. Because then you can essentially take land and put it away, and it doesn't matter who is in charge. That land is locked up now. And imagine China, Russia, or Saudi Arabia, they have massive sovereign wealth funds. Do you think they would be interested in locking up land and reduce its productive use in the United States? Oh, yeah.
I was so concerned last year when I heard, last year or maybe the previous year, that Bill Gates Foundation bought 300,000 acres that was farmable land in Montana, and it just locks it up. So it's no
But you know
longer.
what? They're probably raising crickets, so don't worry about it.
Ah, yes. I thought they were producing those in a larva factory in Canada, but I'm sure they'll be here as well. So these things, we're really concerned when we just look to our neighbor to the north, right, with Trudeau, who is basically that Benito Mussolini reincarnate up north. And they pulled the trigger during the strikes from the truckers on the digital currency to turn off bank accounts. Did they not? Can you speak? Because that's the last effort that we know. And we know from a Judeo-Christian worldview of eschatology, there will be a world leader in the future that will get power for a while, that you won't be able to buy or sell without a digital passport, so to speak, on your right hand or your forehead. And we know him as the Antichrist, the beast. He's got all kinds of titles. But now we see he's a political leader that just gets the power to turn off your bank account so you can't buy milk or gas. Tell me a little bit about that and where the pushback is.
Well, it's a major concern because we have the technology today to implement that kind of system, and we see it in China. China has already started rolling this out in some of their provinces. There's a story of a news reporter who couldn't buy a train ticket because of a news report that he had done, or was on some kind of a blacklist. So we know that this is happening in the world. In our Constitution, there is a part that talks about states that they don't have the ability to create their own currency, but they can use gold and silver. In
Kentucky's Constitution, actually.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And so we're
Going
looking
to
at
Kentucky.
and we're looking at what can we do in the state of Utah. I know other states are looking at other things, similar kinds of things. How can we protect
Texas
us?
is also trying to pursue that.
Yeah, exactly. So, so there are things that we're looking at that will not necessarily do away with CBDC, but will provide an alternative way to transact.
Because at this time, gold exchange is exchanged as a collectible, so its value that goes up or down, you have to pay profit or taxes, and it's a little bit more complicated, correct?
Exactly. It's hard to carry gold around and try and shave off whatever amount you want to use. It's just not practical. Right. And so how do you transact in gold and silver in a way that is practical? And that's kind of the things we're looking at.
So they want us to go back net zero. Net zero by 2050 puts all of us back into the dark ages.
Yeah.
It takes away petroleum. You're no longer flying. You're no longer traveling. You're going to have to live by work so you can walk there back and forth. I would say get a horse, but they're going to kill the horses and the sheep and the various things because they're emitting their carbon-producing creatures.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, we emit carbon too. Right?
But
about 4%. So if we have to be net zero, what does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah. So it just kind of flows into the euthanizing those who are the least productive that Hitler implemented, right? Those who are, they're mentally handicapped, they're older, they're no longer contributing. We've already got the abortion thing that we're taking lives, we can't have no more children. So it's really an anti-human agenda. It's anti-human flourishing, as Alex Epstein would say, because it's not about It's about impacting
It's
creation at
about
all.
human impact on the environment, not the other way around, right? And that's the fundamental problem with it, is if we are trying to reduce human impact on the environment, then the best way to do that is to reduce humans.
Right. So Bill Gates said in a TED Talk, 2012, we should be able to control the population by X, Y, and Z and vaccines. So vaccines should extend people's lives, right? The purpose of vaccine is to cure or to inoculate against disease.
Right.
But if that's how we're controlling the population, what is that? Is it sterilizing? Is it somehow having some kind of effect that there is a fear of overpopulation?
Yeah, well, and we see what happened in China as a result of this same fear. Deng Xiaoping, I believe, was convinced that China was going to have a overpopulation problem. They put in the one-child policy, and now they're having serious demographic issues where at current trajectories in China, the population of China by the end of the century could be 400 million. Just because of the dying off of their population. But like with the one-child policy, they can go in reverse and now force women to have children, right? I mean, it is crazy.
Yeah, if you're a totalitarian regime, that's what you do. It's
Well,
all
and
by coercion.
Yes, and what's amazing is how many of these people from Davos and the like look to China as an example of, great leadership.
That is their model on the technology side, and then the Marx socialism, there are nine things about the 2030, right? You'll own nothing, you'll be happy, you'll eat less meat. You're going to Washington, D.C. this week?
Yes.
And you're going to be testifying.
Yep, the House Ways and Means Committee.
What's your about this overall? Are you going to make this presentation? What kind of
No,
presentation?
it'll be like a 5-minute statement and then Q&A, basically just talking about ESG.
So what hope do you see at the state level, at your capital in Salt Lake City? And you've been back and forth to Washington, D.C. You're interacting with people. This is alarming stuff. Anybody, I've been watching and studying this for, the last 3 years, and watching Davos and all of those different things. And the agenda, how do you see a way forward? Is there receptivity and awakening, and let's move to action?
Yes, there's definitely an awareness that was not there a couple of years ago. We've passed 4 laws last year in the state of Utah related to ESG that prevents boycotting of companies. If I'm trying to do business with a bank, that bank has to attest that they're not involved in these sorts of activities. It's part of our BDS laws, the Boycott, Divest, Sanction Israel law, and so it's a similar kind of activity that these banks are doing and insurance companies, et cetera. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is educate people, because I think when people realize what's at stake and what the real issues are, they're against it. And so talking with our congressional leaders, a very important development just a few months ago, it actually started last year. So I've been treasurer for about 2.5 years in the state of Utah. And Utah actually has the best credit in the world. It's better than the U.S. Treasury credit. When you look at a credit rating of a company or a state that's looking to borrow money, they have a credit rating that is assigned by the credit rating agencies. Utah has a AAA rating, which means we're the highest credit rating in the world. But I've been told, my staff has actually been told by some of the credit rating agencies, if there was a quadruple A rated state, it would be the state of Utah. We have a very long history of conservatively managing our financial operations. And so I talked all around the state to people and said, look, we have the best credit in the world, but if we have a separate ESG rating, it may not matter. Now, what that credit rating allows us to do is borrow at the lowest rates in the capital markets, making it less expensive for the state of Utah to borrow money and less expensive on taxpayers. But if we had a separate ESG score, investors in the marketplace could say, well, yeah, Utah has the lowest credit in the world, but look at their policies on X, Y, or Z, and then extract a price on the state of Utah. And so I had been talking about that, and then March of last year, I got an email from S&P Global, which is one of the largest credit rating agencies, saying, Treasurer Oaks, we'd like to talk to you about the ESG factors we plan to apply to the state of Utah. And I thought, oh, great, here it is. So I went straight to the Attorney General, and I said, we have got to fight this. And we put together a letter to S&P, the head of S&P, saying the state of Utah does not want an ESG rating on us, and we do not accept this. We got buy-in from the entire, all the constitutional officers, the governor, lieutenant governor, the treasurer, the auditor, the attorney general, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and our entire congressional delegation, including Mitt Romney, all signed that letter back to S&P saying we do not want a separate ESG rating. 6 weeks ago, my deputy, I hear him screaming from his office saying, Marlo won, Marlo won. He had no respect. He didn't even say Treasurer Oaks. And I'm like, what is going on? And he said S&P just announced that they are no longer supplying a separate ESG score on different entities.
So on a state-by-state level, when you have that kind of unity and education, it's really understanding what's at stake.
Yes, and it's really important that the states act. So what Amy's doing in California is critical because she is changing the dynamic in the state of California and impacting policy in the state that impacts other states. What Utah did had an impact on all the other states because now S&P is no longer supplying a separate ESG rating. The states have to act, and that's one thing that I recognized early on is that the private sector is under attack by ESG. It's going to have to be the states that step up and assert our sovereignty, and that's what we have to do.
Wow. That's awesome. At the state level, because we know that digital currency is coming, what do you feel like is holding that back right now? The tide, because there seems to be this global swirling, and we really, I mean, obviously, I'm a preacher, so there is a nefarious, evil spirit to all of this globalism and what its agenda is. How long, from your perspective or in your observations, are we able to hold that back?
That's a great question. Well, and you know, you read the Bible, it doesn't really add to your optimism, right? It's like, oh man. So I really don't know.
We were going to end on a high note. Sorry, folks.
Sorry.
It was going to be,
Let's just keep the Bible out of it.
I'm a preacher, I'm sorry.
I know, you know, what do you do? But you know, the beauty of the Bible, though, is that this is a Christian nation. That we are a Christian nation, and so long as we serve the God of this land, we will be protected. And that's what we have to do.
Amen. So the people, because I've talked to people that are into the Bitcoin. Oh, this is how we're getting around that. That's how we're doing this. But they outlawed it in China. There's 192 countries, you know, registered with the United Nations. They can chase them from country to country to country, right? But countries are going to slowly, because of the tax factor and the IRS and all of those things, are going to want to go after Bitcoin. Is it really as safe as they say it is? I'm not.
Yeah, it's hard because, well, one of the vulnerabilities to Bitcoin that I think about is that it's dependent on the electric grid. Right? I mean, what are they doing to the electric grid and power, right? If you don't have power, if you don't have the internet, where's your Bitcoin, right? So that's one of the concerns. That I see that as a major concern of Bitcoin. You know, all the other issues that other people raise, I haven't heard that one raised, but it's hard to know what to do. And so at the end of the day, I think people really need to think about their relationship to God. I mean, at the end of the day, that is what is going to save us.
Yes, amen. I totally agree 100%. Yeah. So is there anything at the personal level that you and your family, you would give a word of advice? Hey, These things are coming. I mean, it was startling when I tracked the story of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
I mean, and then just about 6 months ago, Secretary Kerry, John Kerry, was in Africa speaking to what country, and he was telling them basically to stay at night. He's telling them to stay in the dark ages.
Yeah.
You know, you can't have cheap petroleum.
Right.
Because cheap energy brings innovation. That transforms
That is the
everything.
foundation of growth and prosperity. If you don't have that, you don't have
Of industrializing
prosperity.
your nation.
Yeah, exactly.
And raising them out of
That's
poverty.
right.
One tractor can make 1 million loaves of bread.
Exactly.
And you know what I mean, as far
That's
as
right.
like harvesting grain and various things.
Yes.
So if there's traction, President Biden is implementing all these things. The appliances that he's going
Yes,
after.
yes.
Anybody, losing your
Yeah,
appliances. that
natural
he's-
got, going after natural gas. Pizza ovens. I saw some headlines. Pizza ovens in New York. Hello, are you trying to destroy New York? You don't have a pizza oven in New York? Do you have New York? No.
It's no longer even New York
No.
at that point. It's unbelievable. Okay, well, we're going to end on New York pizza. Why not? But thank you so much, Treasurer Oaks. Ladies and gentlemen, Marlo Oaks. Thank you so much. There's a table out there. Amy, is that you got a table of stuff out there? There's T-shirts. So you want to stop by and get a per T-shirt or whatever it might be. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Thanks again, Treasurer Oaks. It's really been informative and helpful. And I know there were some layers that you revealed to us that I was not aware of that I'm so thankful for. So God bless you guys. See you next time.